Hey class, in this video we're going to cover the ins and outs of creating an effective transition action brief that really captures and um, displays and explains the narrative story underneath all of your data. So when I'm talking about that narrative story, those big themes that are in your 2.4 of your organizer that you're creating your data-driven recommendations for. So how often things are happening, when they do, how effective are they, how prepared are stakeholders to implement specific evidence-based practices, and what are the factors that are impacting that implementation, along with what are recommendations to mitigate some of those factors or improve these practices. So in doing that, you're going to be pulling from both your quantitative and your qualitative data like you've been doing this semester. But the key about your transition action brief, and there are two things to remember. The two key things are to provide the key information, not your complete summary of all of your results, just the key results that get across your big picture. And then whenever possible, think visually in terms of how you represent some of your big themes and your sub-themes. So we're going to talk about a lot of strategies for that throughout this video, but those are two things we're going to be thinking about. So in terms of the components of the transition action brief, you need to have a short description of the problem in practice. That's copied right from your organizer. You have to have your research question, which is also copied from your organizer. An explanation of what your domain of practice is that's being investigated in your research question is. So what is the evidence-based predictor definition and some of the main sub-practices? And then your results. So professional roles represented if you took any demographic data, but most importantly, your major themes from the integrated analysis table, pulling from those final summaries you're creating, and visualizations to support reader understanding of your themes. The final component after that results section is your recommendations for practice, specific recommendations step by step for how to improve practice for each of your themes. So if you have 3 themes, you should have recommendations specific to each of those themes. So I want to start off just by showing you an annotated example of strategies, and this is also in Blackboard for you, this annotated example. So you can use this while you're creating yours above and beyond the video. So this is all fictitious data that represents some of the ongoing case study we've used throughout this semester with XYZ High School. So you'll notice I have my problem in practice from earlier on in the semester here. And when copying in that problem in practice, if you have a really long problem in practice, just focus on having one paragraph that summarizes the big ticket items there. But judging by the way you had written your problem in practice already, you should just be able to copy and paste that directly into the brief. And then I have comments here on the sidebar, but the reason that we use problem in practice first is because our readers need to be able to contextualize the results they're about to see, and they need to be able to understand and unpack those results objectively and in the same lens that you're looking at them and presenting them in. We want our participants to, well, the last thing we want is our participants to be presented with data and not know what context it's happening in, where it's coming from, what drove the question that you're investigating. So you want them to have a full picture because they weren't involved in any of the background work of your study. We want them to have the same working knowledge that you do. With that said, we don't need to know all the ins and outs about what type of study, how you created your tool, in depth of all of that. But we do need them to know what the problem in practice situating the action research is, because the reason for action research, as we know, is to identify a problem in practice and then create recommendations and a plan to improve it. So without knowing what the problem in practice is, then it becomes hard for them to find meaning in what the results are and your recommendations. They don't see how it connects from the start to the end. So you can see on the first page of this example transition action brief that I created for you, I have clear, bold, accentuated what the research question is. And I've used accents on the text, particularly bolding, to highlight what the independent and the dependent variables are. Notice I'm not saying what they are because that's a little bit too jargony for a reader, right? For most readers, they're not familiar with that language. And really, they don't need to know that. They just need to know what's being investigated. What are those practices? And what are those outcomes? And then from that, we can't expect all readers to have the same definition in their head of what career readiness skills are. But it's critical that they do as they look at all of your data and your results that you're going to provide for them in the next part of the brief. So it's really important that you give them that additional context of some key practices that are related to career readiness skills, or whatever this is just in this example, but whatever your dependent variable is for your students or your stakeholders, right? Whatever your dependent variable is, that in this case, career readiness skills, we want them to know generally what does that include? What are some of those practices that students should be able to do for career readiness skills? And then really important, a definition overall, this is taken from Rowe, so taken from the literature, from evidence-based literature, about what does supporting career readiness at kind of a 50,000 foot level look like. So now in your study, when in this next part of the brief, when you start showing them results and start talking about your key findings, when you're saying things like, investigating how often instruction happens for career readiness, your readers can say, oh yeah, so they're talking about supporting, students' active listening and resume and interview skills. Okay. And I know from this previous part of the report that supporting it is at least going to be using transition assessment and work skills instruction, in school and in the community. So they have some context about the results they're about to see. And you're giving all of that to them without them needing to read any additional literature in order to kind of get on the same page as you are. So after, in your transition action brief, once you've given the problem in practice, your research question, and a brief description of what are those key skills and how are they supported, it's important to succinctly visualize for your readers how you came to the findings that you unearthed. So what you don't want to do is explain the ins and outs of how you created your tool. That is way too much information, and in keeping with action research, not directly related to them learning something to help them improve practice as a team at your school or your agency in your community. So this goes back again to just helping them contextualize the results they're about to see. Not only do they understand what's being measured, but they understand how we kind of came to these big conclusions, so they can follow your thought process. So in this example here, I just have a quick description. I say a program evaluation was created with questions based upon a systematic review of current literature, right? And then the key practices were transformed into questions. And I showed them, this is one example of how to visualize the funneling technique that you used in your survey, in your program evaluation tool. And this a visual like this, you could also use a flow chart, any type of process model or hierarchical model. This is a really important approach to ensuring that your readers not only understand where the results came from, but you're going to ideally present your results in this same funneling pattern. So you'll start off with what has happened, and then who is doing it, how effective is it, how knowledgeable and skilled they are, and then what are those factors influencing these things, and how can we improve these practices. So you want them to understand that this is how you came to these big themes, but also this is how you're going to present those themes too. This is how you'll have your conversation, and you'll see what that looks like in the next few pages of this example. Don't get too down into the weeds and demographics, but it's important to help them contextualize who took the survey, most definitely. So just include your if you had taken a role, just include your roll numbers for your roles that were represented in the study. So Imagine that our reader has looked at the first page and they have an understanding of what the problem in practice is and the research question and what's being measured and how we came to these big findings and who provided input. Then the next step in the action brief is to show them those results. And the most effective way to do this is to break up your results by major theme, just as you have in your integrated analysis table. So you see here I have major theme 1 and what the major theme is. And then I broke it down into 3 headers. So what's happening and who is doing it? Is it working, right? So is it effective? And are staff prepared to implement evidence-based strategies related to this big theme here? So you can see that I haven't included a big detailed description of all of my results. I've just included the key findings for each. In this case, there are 2 groups that responded, but if you only had 1 group, then you would just include the responses, the big takeaways from that 1 group. If you had 3, 3. So let's just read this first example here and you'll get an idea of what this succinct summary should look like. So results showed that teachers are mostly using academic assessments on a monthly N equals 18 basis to inform instruction for career readiness skills. So that's all of my teacher information right there. And then I say job coaches are mostly using informal approaches on a weekly basis to inform the career readiness instruction they provide to students. As a whole, teachers are most often never using observations, interest inventories, student assessments, job evaluations, career development measures, or self-determination assessments. So we're not including a big detailed description, we're just giving the key takeaways. And notice how I'm not including responses and results for all of the rank options, just the rank options with the highest amount of responses, because that's what's most important to our readers. They want to know what the big ticket items are. So while 18 selected monthly, of course, there were however many participants you have. In this example, it's 20. So there were 2 that responded other, but that's not meaningful to our readers. They want to know specifically what is the most often frequency of using this tool, right? And then for your job coaches, is it different, right? So we want to, if we have 2 different groups, the big thing in our summaries, we want to make sure that if there are differences between the 2 groups, that we provide enough information to let our reader know what those differences look like. And then, is it working? So in keeping with this, if you have 1 group, 2 groups, or 3 groups, you're always going to talk about what each group is doing in a way that helps readers understand explicitly what the differences are between them. And then for 1 or 2 or 3 of those groups, how they are implementing those practices effectively. So is it working what they're doing most often? And then are those staff prepared to implement specific evidence-based strategies? So the thing to remember too here is to provide succinct summaries with just the key results. And I think a good benchmark for this is to copy in your your combined summaries from your integrated analysis table in 2.4 of your organizer, and then look to see if there's any additional things that need to be cut out. For example, having the quantitative results for all of the rank options rather than just the highest rank, the highest chosen rank option, right? So it may not be, like in this example, our highest rank option would have been daily, but that's not the most often chosen. So we're providing the results for what is chosen most often, unless you're trying to show a gap or a lack of practice, then you would you might also show that this was happening most often. And then if ideally it should be happening daily, then you would show the results. Maybe it was monthly N equals 18 and daily N equals 2 to show that contrast between. So that's important as well. And then in terms of your visuals, include 1 or 2 visuals For readers, usually the most important thing and the thing they're really interested in, once they know about how often things are happening and um, if they're effective, they really want to know if people are able to do the things that are asked in terms of this evidence-based practice. And if not, that's a really easy way for readers to start thinking clearly about your recommendations, right? So they're saying, okay, what's happening? Well, maybe we should do that more often, and I guess it's not working that well. And then they see a visual at the end saying, so it's not really happening. Um, when it does, it's not effective. And then staff members are saying, in this example here, and in your example too, you should show where staff members could use additional support to grow or increase their skill or knowledge levels. So then a reader from this page, kind of taken as a whole, can say, okay, academic assessments are used on a monthly basis. Gosh, that's not enough. We need to increase that. Okay. Well, when you use those, do they work? Well, results say that we're doing this a lot, but academic assessments aren't the best way to support making instructional decisions for career readiness. Okay, so we're doing this a lot, but it's not working. Well, do stakeholders know how to do anything else that we might do instead? Oh, okay, I see that stakeholders or teachers and job coaches aren't really prepared to use another strategy other than what we're doing right now. So that tells me as a reader, okay, I understand what this problem, what this big major theme is already. And just some tricks and tips for presenting your visuals. In addition to following the guidelines that I've showed you this semester, particularly in Module 8 and 9, for working with your quantitative and also your qualitative information when you quantify it. These line charts, if you choose to use them, you want to make sure that your readers understand how to interpret this type of chart and really any type of chart that you provide them. So it doesn't matter what type of chart it is. If it's a bar chart, line chart, a pie chart, you want to make sure that your readers know how to interpret that chart. With the understanding that many readers won't have any experience with data prior to reading your transition action brief, or at least not data presented in this way. And we want the experience to be equitable for all readers. So kind of thinking about this through a UDL lens, you want to make sure that you have just some snapshots here with a clear description. And through that UDL lens, it's important to use color coding here. So you can see I've used the same color in the word novice as there is in the graph for the novice line. And then other lines here, right? So these two for intermediate and expert in my explanation. So this will draw the attention of the reader to both the chart, and they can look at the chart as a visual reference when they're reading this description of how to analyze it. So rather than providing a description that kind of sits secondary to the chart, you want to create a description that supplements the chart, that can the description and the chart can kind of be read together as a whole, rather than look at the chart, read a description, and then look back at the chart to understand it. It should be one cohesive single experience. And that's what this type of example here allows the reader to do. So important, in this example here, I just have this for one major theme, but you'll have a page like this that has what's happening and who's doing it, how effective it is, and how prepared staff are, with both, as you see here, quantitative and qualitative information, key themes. For each of your major themes. So if you have 3 themes, you should have a page for each theme. So one page for each theme. I recommend not having any more than one page for each theme, because you'll overload your readers. The only time you should have more than one page per theme if you're trying to cut down on the amount of text on the page, in order to fit visuals in a way that people can clearly see the numbers and the visuals that you're providing. So that's the only time you should be doing that. You should not be including additional pages because your paragraphs are long. So kind of as a benchmark, you shouldn't have any more than 4 or 5 sentences per of these 3 kind of funneling buckets, right? And you can see here in terms of that funneling that the way that I've organized this page directly resembles this model here. So in terms of your major themes, I recommend along with your recommendations, your data-driven recommendations, include some of the quantified and quantified qualitative and raw qualitative data about recommendations to improve that particular major theme. So in this fictitious example here, I have some data, quantified codes from open responses about how transition assessment could be improved, and then also some in vivo quotes that explain some of those major themes. So this helps them to contextualize and kind of hear the voices of all the staff before they see the recommendations that you created based upon all of the data. So in terms of your recommendations on your transition action brief, the key thing to remember and to kind of check yourself through is that someone should be able to take that chart, sit down with the team, and implement it completely without having to ask any additional questions about what's going to be done and what the outcomes should be. The only questions should be related to who's going to be involved and what the next steps are, who's going to do what. But they shouldn't have any questions about what resources they'll need, what the activities are going to be, what the outcomes should be. So with that said, the example I have here, so based upon my fictitious case study here of XYZ High School, and this major theme of needing to support transition assessment for teachers and for job coaches, providing them new informal and formal tools and how to use them to support career readiness, I would have at least one recommendation for this major theme. So ideally you have for each major theme at least one recommendation that includes the activities, resources, outcomes, and collaborator or team members that are going to have to be involved to make these actions, resources, and outcomes come together. So in my example here, based upon the data that we just looked at, I had said that my recommendation is to create a Google Classroom with a video training and activity sheets to teach evidence-based strategies for informal and formal assessment, transition assessment, in a way that's used formatively to make instructional decisions about career readiness. And I said that we should create a community of practice around transition assessment on that Google site by having monthly webinars and meetings where staff could work in teams to review tool beforehand and then teach that tool either through live or recorded video that's posted on that Google site, that Google Classroom, on how to use that tool within the school. So showing that tool in context of the students that everyone is working with. And so if that's what our action is, then we have to list our specific resources, whenever possible, direct links to the resources that should be used. So that looks like, rather than just saying pulling from articles about transition assessment, providing the specific articles that should be used, or toolkits or guides. So here, in keeping with that level of specificity, I have a direct link to the NTAC resource for age-appropriate transition assessment. I also, so you'll want to include, obviously there'll be resources that haven't been created yet. So one of those things is maybe blank transition assessments. Those could also be found online. So we'll want to provide a link for that if that's how it's going to go. The Google Classroom would have to be created, the PowerPoint slides, the tutorial videos. In addition to that, if we're talking about a case study example, if the school and teams and staff are not going to create a case study example, in this example of transition assessment, they could go online and download one of the, there's about a dozen full case examples created by NTACT related to transition assessment, where stakeholders can go on, download those, and then think about the types of assessment that they would use with that student. So rather than having to go through all the work to make this actionable, right? Because action research is about quick, practical, applicable recommendations that can be done, in real time with teams during meetings and the times they have available in order to improve these outcomes. So rather than creating case study examples, which is most likely above the bandwidth of all the staff, just download them, and I have a direct link right there for my staff members, if this was my action brief, for them to start downloading those case study examples. So if I have a clear explanation of actions and the resources needed to make those actions happen, then the third component is, so if we do these things, if we pull upon those resources to implement these activities, then what will the outcomes be? So you need to see a direct connection between the action and the outcome, and the outcome being dependent upon those resources being drawn upon and implemented. So I have that teachers will learn an evidence-based model for transition assessment, and that would be done by watching their fellow team members and also reading about those transition assessments in the NTAC resource. And then teachers and job coaches would learn how to use formal and informal assessment tools through this online community of practice, but also through that NTAC resource. And then in doing this, kind of the secondary influence would be that we develop a school level online resource center for transition assessment that is relevant to the strengths, needs, and factors influencing the student population and staff at the school. And this happens because as staff members are continually working together in this online space and then outside of that online space in their classrooms to talk about these different transition assessments, how to use them and how to make them more effective, these resources put onto that space would be kind of a grassroots approach to creating an online center for the school staff to continually learn from each other and to house that information rather than it being in silos across classrooms or between teachers and stakeholders like job coaches or administrators and coordinators. So if this is what my actions and outcomes are, then who are my collaborators that need to be involved in this to make this happen? So ideally, we have LEA staff involved with the expectation that schools may not have knowledge about informal and formal age-appropriate transition assessment to support career readiness, but LEA staff likely will. Also, the SPED coordinator in the school, if possible, all of the teachers, so those grassroots boots on the ground staff who are directly working with students who are the ones who are going to be implementing and using these transition assessments. And ideally engaging your state technical assistance whenever possible, because states are heavily involved in transition assessment for districts and the state as a whole to be compliant under Indicator 13 for age-appropriate transition goals and a transition plan that is updated annually, right, that draws upon transition assessment, valid transition assessment. So state technical assistance will be already heavily involved in ensuring that districts and communities are using transition assessment effectively. So they'll likely already have resources, particularly webinars and PowerPoints that may already be available. So just sending a quick email to your LEA or maybe to the state technical assistance, if you have that connection, could help you gain additional resources. In this case, maybe that's a spot that we could gain resources to put on our Google Classroom. So our staff at the school could not only be contributing to that space, but we could put in additional evidence-based, research-based resources from the district level or state level to inform what we're doing in this example in terms of transition assessment. So that's the end of that transition example, that transition action brief example. And I just want to go through kind of a recap, and then we'll talk about some creative ways to visualize your data, to think visually about your major themes. So we want to make sure that For your results, for each one of these pages here, so I'm talking about this page here, that each one of those pages for each major theme talks about what's happening, what is working, are staff ready, prepared, knowledge, and skilled to implement specific evidence-based practices. Based upon this information here, what could be better? So often drawing upon those qualitative responses that you include at the end of your program evaluation tool, and then your specific data-driven recommendations to improve practice on the following page. So you can see that format clearly here. So I have hit on what's happening, who's doing it, right? Is it working? Are they prepared? And then my recommendations on the second page. So that's the format that you're going to follow. In terms of thinking visually, I want to just go over some ways above and beyond what we've already done this semester to visualize your results for your readers. So in addition to just doing a sentence or two about who participated in the survey in the program evaluation tool, you can use pie charts. This is the most often accepted way to show your breakdown of demographics. So that's the number of participants in each one of these cuts here, along with the percentage. For bar charts, you can use those for single Likert questions. Remember, don't use those for multi-grid questions. So you already know how to do that from our previous modules for quantitative analysis this semester. Also creating line charts for your multi-rank grid questions. So that was also in our module for quantitative analysis and visualizing them. And you can use the data tool to create these line charts to put into your report. In any case that, so this normally doesn't apply, but in any case where you have composite scores, so you have done something like the mean for each one of these categories, like maybe you had a mean score for expert, a mean score for intermediate, a mean score for novice, you could also use line charts for those as well, but almost no one is doing that for their study this semester. So 99.9% of the time, this is the chart you're going to be using. Some additional ways, so in addition to those bar charts and line graphs, you can also provide your cross tabulations in tables. Make sure that you're using the principles of UDL in terms of using darker shades to identify your question and your total, lighter shades, but also bolding to help them understand the categories, right? So role and scale. You can also use, as we talked about in our qualitative analysis and quantifying our qualitative codes this semester, you can use bar charts to show how often your major themes in your qualitative information appeared. You want to make sure that you have clear descriptions for your readers. So not only providing the chart, but explaining to them where this data came from, because they don't understand what quantifying qualitative themes are. So you need to do that in 1 or 2 sentences and explain that to them, like I've done right there. Another way to visualize your qualitative codes, once you have quantified them in terms of how many times they appear uniquely across your participants. So if you have 18 participants, 20, right, in this example, 20 participants, then you want to quantify that first, right? So how many of your participants had a response that related to a particular theme? One way that you can show your big themes and the sub-themes within them, specifically your literature-based themes, right? So curriculum and transition assessment, and then your descriptives inside of them, is to use a tree map. So you can see here in a tree map, you have this first row is always what the literature in your study, it should always be the literature-based codes. So if you have 2 literature-based codes, 3, you should have one of these for each. You can see that it'll highlight them, right? So this is kind of one block. This is the block related to transition assessment. And this is the block related to curriculum. And then these sub-blocks here get larger or smaller depending on how many responses had that particular code assigned to them. So you see here, only 8 individuals had referenced career clubs, 10 career readiness standards, 18 work-based learning experiences. And then you can see how the boxes get larger or smaller depending on the number of participants who had that code assigned to them. And then in order to make one of those, you'll follow these instructions down here of going up into your chart option and then hierarchy, and then clicking on tree map, and then set your data up this way. So you can see here's a clear example. Your data should be set up as literature-based code first, and you have to have all your literature-based codes in order. So don't have transition assessment curriculum, transition assessment curriculum, have them all blocked out together. Otherwise, the chart won't put them in these individual blocks like they need to be. And then you'll have things that are related to transition assessment over in curriculum and vice versa, and then it won't be interpretable. So your first column A should be your literature code, your column B should be your descriptive code, and then column C is your frequency of how often those codes occurred across participants. And really, I think the easiest way, if you're looking to make one of these to show the hierarchy of codes in a visual way for your results, you can just copy this chart right here and paste it into your brief, and then you can just open up by going to right click on the chart and then edit in Excel. And by doing that, you'll get this exact table right here, and you can just replace the literature codes and the descriptive codes and the frequency of those codes with your data. And then you'll already have the color, formatting, and everything already set up. That's totally fine. And that'll save you a lot of time. In keeping with this idea of visualizing hierarchies, you can also visualize results from Likert questions as a hierarchy. So a hierarchical visual, the purpose of that is to show from the most chosen response option all the way down to the least chosen response option in a visual way. So showing that size decrease. So what we're not doing is starting off with our lowest rank or highest rank option and going in order of the rank as we had created it. We're going in order of how many responses for each one of those from greatest to smallest. So you can see here, this is a nice way to visualize never, monthly, annually, weekly, all the way down to nothing for daily. So this is another way to show a bar chart. You can't do this with a multi-grid, but you can do this with questions that are measuring quantitatively a single practice. So in this case, it was informal transition assessments used to measure student self-management skills. And once again, this is how to make one, just like we had done before. So in this time, you're going to click on that insert and then chart. But this time, you're going to click on waterfall rather than hierarchy, and then click on funnel, because we're funneling down from that highest chosen option all the way down to the lowest chosen option. The last example I want to give you in keeping this idea of hierarchical visuals is a way to, instead of just using funnels or hierarchies to show results from one or two questions, showing results across your entire major theme. So if my major theme is transition assessment, increasing the effectiveness of transition assessment, then one way I could use one of these funnel graphs here is to include my major theme right up here, right? So this is my major theme, the use of transition assessments to support career readiness instruction. This isn't a particular question. This is just a major theme from my data. And then I would include only the highest chosen response option for the question about how often, and then how effective, and then skill. So here we have my highest response option in my fictitious data was annually. So annually assessing career readiness skills, and then I have the number of participants that had said that they annually assess career readiness skills. And then from that, the number of participants who said that assessment of career readiness skills was ineffective. And then down, our next step down is the number of participants who said they have novice skill with career readiness assessment practices. So now in one graphic here, my reader says, okay, how often, how effective, how skilled, and then, okay, what are those major factors if it's only happening annually and it's not working and they're not prepared to use other assessment methods, then what are my major findings? And I included my most often occurring themes, so just my major qualitative theme, one of them. But you could also include more than that if you wanted to. But you'd have to have each one of them in their own, with their own chart, with their own bar chart. So you can see here in this example, this is a way of presenting essentially everything that is on this in this text right here. So everything that's in this text right here, distilled down a little bit further. So even more so what we call aggregating, right? So in this example here, I have collapsed across groups, but you could also show, you know, how often, how effective, how skilled, and the major factors related to just one group, and then make another one of these charts right here for your second group. Or you could just combine the responses and aggregate, so go back up like we've been doing this semester, and show the results just at a 50,000 foot view. And this is an example right here of showing in one chart the big takeaways from all of this text right here. So this is a way that you could do that. That's not to say that you shouldn't have your text description. You should most definitely have your text description following this format here, but you could include, rather than a visual related to just one of these areas, so like how skilled practitioners are, you could include a hierarchical visual like this at the end of that page that would summarize all of your data. And we can work together between now and the end of the semester to create one of these, if this is what you'd like to do in your action brief, to visualize each of your major themes. And this is how you would do it. So you would go back to your chart and waterfall again, and this is still a funnel. Even though we're using it for multiple questions, it's still a funnel like the previous example. And here's what that would look like. So we'd have our how often, or how effective, our skill, and our key qualitative theme, and then just the number of participants who had given that response. So that's it for this lecture. This entire document as a PDF file is and as a PowerPoint file are available in the Blackboard module for module 12. And so this way you'll be able to read it, but also to open it up in PowerPoint and copy and paste some of these visuals directly into your chart, into your transition action brief, in order to make some of these visuals for yourself. So you have free reign to copy these visuals in to your transition action brief and change some of the categories and numbers and colors to fit the major themes in your data. I've included them here for you as a PowerPoint, so you can do that. In addition to these examples here, in the course I've also included a full example of technical assistance that I created for the Bureau of Special Ed in Pennsylvania related to transition assessment. So it doesn't have anything to do with this fictitious data here, but it does align directly with the major theme that I was using as an example. So you can, while you don't need to create an additional PowerPoint or documents, you can kind of see when teams take a data-driven approach, in action research what some of the deliverables can look like, but you don't have to create any type of professional development. That's not a requirement. Just the transition action brief is required. But I wanted you to see kind of down the road. So if you create a transition action brief, what are the next steps? What does that actually look like in the real world? In addition to that, I have included about 20 or 25 slides worth of different visuals and graphics, like this one above here and others that you can copy into your transition action briefs as you're creating them to visualize processes and hierarchies and trends and things like that we've talked about in different ways. So there are a bunch of different visuals in there that you're free to use as well, and I've compiled those for you. And the example that I showed you in the module from that state example uses a lot of the visuals from that template file I'm sharing, so you can not only see the template file, but also how they've been used in the real world. So I think that'll help you contextualize how some of these visuals can be used above and beyond the examples I've shown here.